The night was silent, but inside Sarah's heart there was a storm. She sat on the edge of her small bed, staring at the cracked ceiling of her one-room apartment. Her hands trembled as she held a letter she never wanted to read. The words were simple but cruel. "I cannot continue with you. I have found someone else." Her chest tightened. It felt like the world had ended in that single moment. Just yesterday, she believed she had a future with Daniel, the man she trusted with her whole heart. They had talked about marriage, about children, about building a life together. She had dreamed of white dresses, happy mornings, and evenings filled with laughter. But in one day, everything was gone. Tears rolled down her cheeks, soaking the paper until the ink blurred. Sarah pressed the letter against her chest, as if holding it tightly would change its meaning. She whispered to herself, "Why me? What did I do wrong?" Life had never been kind to her. She grew up in a broken home. Her father left when she was only 6 years old, and her mother struggled to raise her alone. Money was always a problem. There were nights when they had no food, and mornings when she went to school hungry. Yet, she always believed that love could heal her scars. When she met Daniel, she thought God had finally given her a reason to smile. But now, she was left with nothing but pain. She stood up, pacing the tiny room. Her furniture was old, her walls were stained, and her dreams seemed too heavy for her fragile body. She tried to breathe, but the air felt too thick. She whispered, "Tomorrow will be better," though deep inside, she did not believe it. Her phone buzzed. For a moment, hope lit her eyes, but when she checked, it was a bank message. Balance. Only a few dollars. Her job at the grocery store barely paid enough for rent. Now, with her heart broken, even going to work felt like a mountain she could not climb. That night, she lay down but could not sleep. Her mind replayed memories of Daniel, his smile, his promises, his gentle voice. Each memory cut her deeper. She turned to the wall and cried quietly, not wanting the neighbors to hear. The moonlight coming through the window touched her face, but it gave her no comfort. Days passed, but the pain remained. Sarah went to work, but her eyes were always red. She carried heavy boxes, arranged shelves, and forced a smile at customers, but inside, she was breaking. Sometimes, she went to the bathroom just to cry where no one could see. Her coworkers noticed the change. One of them, Anna, tried to comfort her. "Sarah, life is hard, but you are strong," she said softly. Sarah only nodded. She wanted to believe those words, but strength felt like something far away. At night, she often sat by the window, staring at the city lights. She thought of the life she wanted but could not reach. She wondered if happiness was only for other people, not for her. Still, a small voice inside whispered, "Tomorrow is another life." One evening, as she walked home from work, it began to rain. She had no umbrella, so she ran, her clothes getting soaked. People around her laughed under their umbrellas, couples held hands, families rushed home together. Sarah felt more alone than ever. She stopped in the middle of the street, lifted her face to the sky, and let the rain mix with her tears. A man passing by offered her his umbrella, but she shook her head. "No, thank you," she said quietly. She wanted to feel the rain, as if it could wash away the pain in her heart. But when she reached home, her body was shivering, and her soul was still heavy. That night, she prayed. It had been a long time since she prayed sincerely, but she knelt by her bed and whispered, "God, please, I don't know how to continue. I feel lost. If tomorrow truly is another life, show me. Give me strength." Her voice broke as she prayed, but a small warmth filled her chest. It was not a solution, but it was a flicker of hope. The next morning, she looked at herself in the mirror. Her eyes were swollen, her face pale, but she saw something else too. She was still alive. The pain had not killed her. She thought, maybe this is not the end. Maybe tomorrow really is another life. Still, the road ahead was not easy. Her rent was late, and her landlord had already warned her. At work, the manager told her she might lose her job if she kept coming late. Sarah felt like she was drowning, but she kept moving, one step at a time. One afternoon, she received another shock. She was called into the office and told her job was no longer needed. She tried to argue, but the manager shook his head. "I'm sorry, Sarah. Times are hard. We have to cut staff." She left the building with her box of belongings, her heart pounding. Now she had nothing, no job, no love, no family nearby. She sat on a bench by the roadside, watching cars pass by. Her mind screamed, "It's over. You have failed." But then, as she sat there, an old woman selling oranges came close. The woman smiled kindly and said, "My child, why are you crying? Don't cry too much. Tomorrow is another life." Sarah froze. Those were the same words she had whispered to herself in the dark. Hearing them from a stranger felt like a message. She looked into the old woman's eyes and saw wisdom, strength, and survival. Maybe life was not about avoiding pain, but about rising after falling. She wiped her tears, took a deep breath, and stood up. She still didn't know how she would pay rent or what her future held, but for the first time in weeks, she felt a spark of courage. Because maybe, just maybe, tomorrow truly is another life. The days that followed were some of the hardest in Sarah's life. Losing her job felt like losing the last piece of stability she had. She woke up each morning with heavy eyes and a heavier heart, wondering how she would survive the day. The rent was due, her cupboards were almost empty, and she had no idea where her next paycheck would come from. Her landlord was not a kind man. He knocked on her door one morning, his voice sharp. "Sarah, you have 1 week. If you don't pay the rent, you're out." Sarah swallowed hard. She wanted to beg for more time, but his eyes showed no mercy. "I understand," she whispered, her voice trembling. When he left, she leaned against the door, sliding down to the floor as tears spilled from her eyes. The world seemed too cruel, too heavy for her fragile soul. Still, she forced herself to move. She dressed neatly and went from shop to shop, handing out applications and asking if there were vacancies. Most people shook their heads. Others gave polite smiles and said they would call her, though she knew they wouldn't. At one bakery, the manager looked at her resume and laughed quietly. "We need someone with experience," he said, handing the paper back without a second glance. Sarah left the bakery with her head down. Each rejection felt like another stone added to the weight on her shoulders. By the end of the day, her feet were sore, her clothes damp with sweat, and her spirit almost gone. She sat at a bus stop, watching people hurry home, families laughing, children eating ice cream, lovers holding hands. She whispered to herself, "Maybe I'm not meant for happiness." But then she remembered the old woman's words, "Tomorrow is another life." She clung to those words like a lifeline. That night, Sarah opened her small notebook. It was something she had kept since her teenage years, filled with poems, thoughts, and little stories she once dreamed of turning into books. She hadn't touched it in years, but now, as she flipped through the worn pages, she felt a spark. Writing had always given her comfort. She picked up a pen and began to write, not about happiness, but about pain, about struggle, about survival. She wrote until midnight, pouring her heart onto the paper. When she finally closed the notebook, she felt lighter, even though her problems were still the same. For the first time in days, she slept peacefully. The next morning, hunger woke her. She opened her cupboard and found only a loaf of bread and half a jar of peanut butter. She ate slowly, saving every bite, and then went out again to look for work. Days turned into weeks. The rejections kept coming, and her money kept running out. One evening, she came home to find her landlord waiting. "Your time is up," he said coldly. "If you don't have the rent tomorrow, you're out." Sarah begged, "Please, just 1 more week. I promise I'll find something." But he shook his head. "I've given you enough time. Tomorrow morning, I want you gone." When he left, Sarah collapsed onto her bed, clutching her pillow. She cried until her body ached. She thought of calling Daniel, asking for help, but her pride stopped her. He had chosen another woman. He had left her broken. She couldn't face him again. That night, she walked to the park. The air was cool, and the stars shone above her. She sat on a bench, hugging her knees, feeling small against the vast sky. God, she whispered, I don't know what to do. I don't want to give up, but I'm so tired. A man sitting on the next bench overheard her. He looked about 40, with tired eyes and a kind face. Life is tough, he said softly. But, the strongest people are the ones who survive the storms. Sarah looked at him, surprised. He smiled faintly. I was homeless once. Slept under bridges. Ate from trash bins. But I kept telling myself that if I woke up tomorrow, it was another chance. Another life. And slowly things changed. His words pierced her heart. She nodded, wiping her tears. Thank you, she whispered. The next morning, she packed her few belongings into a bag. She had no place to go, but she refused to sit and wait for pity. She walked to the city center, where she had seen people selling small things on the street. With the little money she had left, she bought bottled water and tried to resell it to passers-by. At first, no one stopped. Some people ignored her. Others frowned as if she was invisible. But she kept standing there, calling softly, cold water, fresh water. Slowly, a few people bought. By evening, she had made a small profit, just enough for food that night. It was not much, but it was something. That became her routine. Every morning, Sarah stood in the hot sun selling water, snacks, and sometimes small fruits she bought cheaply from the market. It was tiring, her feet hurt, and sometimes she faced insults. But she kept going, telling herself, tomorrow is another life. One afternoon, as she stood under the sun, a group of young men walked by. They laughed at her, mocking her torn shoes and faded dress. One of them said, "Pretty girl like you should be looking for a rich man, not selling water on the street." Sarah's face burned with shame, but she stayed silent. She refused to let their words destroy her spirit. When they walked away, she took a deep breath and whispered to herself, "This is not the end. Tomorrow will be better." Weeks passed, and though her life was still hard, she began to notice small changes. She was stronger than before. She could face long days without breaking down. She could smile at strangers, even when she was tired. She was learning to survive. One evening, as she counted her small earnings, she realized she had saved enough for a week's rent in a smaller, cheaper room. It wasn't much, a tiny space with peeling walls and no furniture, but it was hers. She lay on the floor that night, staring at the ceiling, and felt a flicker of pride. Sarah still had no job, no clear future, and her heart still carried scars from Daniel's betrayal. But she was no longer the same broken woman who had once cried in the rain. She was fighting, step by step, to create another life. And deep inside, she knew this was only the beginning. Because tomorrow, indeed, was another life. Sarah's new room was small and bare, but to her it felt like a castle. It was not the comfort she once dreamed of, but it was proof that she had survived. Each morning, she woke with the sound of roosters from a nearby farm and the smell of fresh bread from a street vendor. She no longer cried herself to sleep every night. Instead, she rose with a little strength in her heart, whispering to herself, "Tomorrow is another life." She continued selling water and snacks on the street. It was not easy. Sometimes the sun was harsh, sometimes rain chased her away, and sometimes people were unkind. Yet, she kept going. She learned how to speak politely to strangers, how to smile even when tired, and how to count every coin carefully. Slowly, she started saving more than she expected. One day, as she stood at her usual spot, a woman in her 40s stopped to buy water. The woman was neatly dressed, her hair tied in a bun, and she carried books in her hand. She looked at Sarah closely and asked, "Why are you selling water here? You look educated." Sarah hesitated. "I lost my job and I needed to survive," she replied quietly. The woman's eyes softened. "My name is Mrs. Collins. I run a small training center where we teach people skills like typing, bookkeeping, and computer use. If you're interested, you can join. The fees are small, and if you can't pay right away, we allow installments." Sarah's heart skipped. She had always wanted to do more than just labor jobs. "Yes, I'm interested," she said quickly, though she worried about the cost. That night, she counted her savings. It wasn't enough to cover the full fee, but it was enough to begin. She told herself, "If I can sell water in the sun, I can study too." The next week, Sarah joined the training center. She sold water during the day and attended evening classes. It was hard, her body was tired, and sometimes her mind felt like giving up. But every time she wanted to quit, she remembered the old woman selling oranges, the man in the park, and her own voice in the dark whispering, "Tomorrow is another life." Slowly, Sarah learned to type fast, to use spreadsheets, and to write simple reports. Her confidence grew with each lesson. She was no longer just surviving, she was building something new. Months passed. One evening, as class ended, Mrs. Collins pulled her aside. "Sarah, you've worked hard. I know a friend who runs a small office and needs an assistant. Would you like me to recommend you?" Sarah's heart pounded. "Yes, please," she said with shining eyes. A week later, she sat nervously in a small office for an interview. The manager, a middle-aged man with glasses, asked her questions about typing, filing, and handling calls. Sarah answered honestly, her voice trembling at first, but growing stronger as she spoke about her training. 2 days later, she received the call. She got the job. Sarah dropped to her knees in her tiny room, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you, God," she whispered. For the first time in a long while, she felt hope shining bright inside her. The job was not glamorous, and the pay was modest, but it was steady and respectable. Sarah worked with all her heart. She arrived early, stayed late when needed, and treated everyone with kindness. Her boss noticed her dedication and soon gave her more responsibilities. With her income, Sarah was able to move into a better apartment. She bought a bed, a table, and a few chairs. Slowly, her life began to look like a home. She no longer ate only bread and peanut butter. She cooked meals and sometimes treated herself to something sweet. Her scars from Daniel's betrayal were still there, but they no longer controlled her. She realized that his leaving had pushed her into a new path, one that was shaping her into someone stronger. One afternoon, as she was filing papers at work, a client came in. He was tall, neatly dressed, with kind eyes. He introduced himself as Michael, a businessman looking to partner with her company. Sarah greeted him politely, and as their eyes met, she felt something she hadn't felt in years, a spark. Michael returned many times over the next weeks for meetings. Each time, he spoke to Sarah warmly, asking how she was doing, making her laugh with small jokes. Unlike Daniel, his words felt genuine, his respect clear. Sarah found herself smiling again, not because she needed love to survive, but because she had healed enough to open her heart. One day, Michael asked if she would like to have coffee with him after work. Sarah hesitated, memories of betrayal flashing in her mind. But then she reminded herself, tomorrow is another life. She nodded and said yes. Their conversation flowed easily. Michael spoke of his struggles starting his business, how he had failed many times before succeeding. Sarah shared pieces of her own journey. Not everything, but enough to show her strength. By the end of the evening, she realized she was not sitting with a stranger, but with someone who understood pain and resilience. Weeks turned into months. Sarah and Michael grew closer. He never rushed her, never made promises he could not keep. He simply walked beside her, encouraging her dreams, respecting her scars. For the first time, Sarah felt what true love should feel like, not chains, but wings. Her career also blossomed. With hard work, she earned a promotion. She began to handle more important tasks and even supervised new staff. Mrs. Collins visited one day and smiled proudly. "You see, Sarah? You believed tomorrow was another life, and now look where you are." Sarah nodded, tears in her eyes. "I almost gave up," she admitted. "But every pain was preparing me for this." One evening, Sarah sat by her window, no longer in a small broken room, but in a cozy apartment with soft lights. She thought of the girl who once cried in the rain, the girl who had nothing, who thought her life was over. That girl was still inside her, but now she was stronger, braver, and full of hope. She whispered, "Tomorrow is another life, and I am living it." And she knew, deep in her heart, that this was not the end of her story. It was only the beginning of a brighter tomorrow. Please don't forget to like, comments, and subscribe for more stories.